All right, guys, welcome to our ninth. I lost count in the middle somewhere, right? So, but it was apparently like our last session was number eight, addiction, and today is our ninth session. We're almost reaching sort of like the tail end of the therapist training program, and it's been, I hope it's been one hell of a journey for you guys in terms of all the content that we've covered. There's been a lot of content, and I hope that it's just the starting point of showing you guys how much the journey kind of is expansive in nature. There's so many different specializations that are available for a therapist, especially in Pakistan, because there's such a requirement for it, right? Our mental health landscape is very much emerging. There are many organizations that are coming up. There are many therapists who are coming up. There are many people who are looking to excel and become specialists. And I do think that particularly in Pakistan, there's a very strong requirement for specialists, such as people being specialists in trauma-informed work, addiction work, somatic work, family work. Family work particularly is something that I feel is very much required for anyone who's interested. And on top of that, it's also I think nowadays with information becoming so accessible, there is a chance that one of you guys who has attended this training now kind of finds something that they might be really, really interested in, right? Like you might have this pursuit that I want to be kind of really working with addiction or working with families or working with trauma and again, it's not limited to anything, right? Because there's such a strong gap in the market, right? And one thing's for sure, if you do decide to become a specialist in any one of these kind of journeys, it will just help you first kind of develop yourself. It'll develop you as a person first, and I think then it will help you work with your clients as well. Okay. Today is, I know it's been a sequence of events, right? So, for example, we started off with, talking about the therapists themselves, how much self-care is required, how much burnout takes place. It's a byproduct of the job itself, right? How the mindset is so important for us to not displace our own journey and use our own journey to help our clients as well. These are all certain parts that we are modeling for our clients, and as we go along, then once we know that we have to be congruent, have unconditional positive regard, and have empathy and have it in a genuine manner, not just in a superficial manner, we get to really, really see ourselves. And then we can use all of these different kind of techniques, humanistic, Gestalt, CBT, any one of these techniques to build a relationship with the client, to build attunement with the client, to build questions for the client, to have basic kind of relationship with the client in whatever modality kind of best suits me or fits me or works with me, so that I can move forward and help my clients through it. So that's been sort of like the first half of our training. As we move on to the depth of the training, the second half of our training, which is all about, okay, now that I've done these two different parts, how can I case conceptualize better, right? How can I really understand that, okay, I have a good relationship with my client. I have a technical kind of proficiency as well in terms of the question I ask, but what's the map? How do I get to see them better? And there you realize psychodynamic, right? There you realize transference, countertransference, different models different models such as developmental immaturity or addiction models are all part of that process that kind of takes place, right? I do remember that there's one thing that we have to cover before we go through this, and it will fit really nicely into this training. But with all of this awareness, there is a lot of change that happens, right? You really change as a person when you're in this profession. Sometimes the change is willing, easy, about time. And sometimes the change is like so painful, right? Because you get to see some things about yourself that you never thought you kind of consciously knew before, also. Right. And sometimes in your client sometimes becomes those great teachers for you that shows you more about yourself. And then what happens is then grief becomes a huge part of our work. Grief is, if I was to say, grief is like the most important technical tool that someone has to have. Therapists need to be able to grieve, very simply, right? Therapists need to be able to grieve. Why? Because they are people who help people through change, right? They help people through changes in life, whether it's willing changes or unwilling changes, and any change causes grief to happen. right? If any change has kind of happened in your life, and that could be, I don't know if how many of you guys remember going from like the third grade to the fifth, fourth grade, where, or from the second grade to the third grade, when you go from like the school changes, and you're kind of, I remember there was a whole change about when social studies and Islamiyat and all of that stuff gets added into your curriculum. Right. And there's this kind of little grief that kind of happens that, oh my God, padhai mushkil ho gayi hai, and things are going to be tough now. Right. There's grief when you're finally, I don't know if how many of you guys remember the first day you guys went to school, right? There's a grief of leaving your parents, right? That there's a grief there, right? There's a grief when you are leaving for, I know, like, what do you call it? Like cultural examples, but like when you leave some for a different country or you leave for a different house and all of those things, there's grief, right? And we kind of sometimes have found ways to manage grief through many different things, but it's important for us to be really, really proficient in grief. And my intention today is to really share with you guys that when you're working with, when you're at this stage, right, where you have resourced the client, have built a relationship, understand the work, and now you're ready to go in and work with the grief, what is required? Right, what is required, how does kind of someone kind of come up and come in, right? Like all of those things that are there. Okay, so that's sort of like the main attention from today is to, okay, if you as a therapist are working with a client that is going through grief, what are some of the things that you have to kind of be mindful for? Number one, right? That's one of the main things. Number two, we're going to go through a simple kind of technique or a tool that's also used to help particularly people go through grief as well, right? So those are the two main things that are going to be covered when it comes to the topic of grief itself. However, before I start that, there is something incomplete from the last training that I do feel like I wanted to kind of share that can hopefully help easily transition into this as well. Okay. So addiction, right? We talked a lot about the chemical addiction and all of those things. We talked about the family in terms of their process. I hope some of that stuff allowed more information or awareness for your own self as well in terms of who you are, in terms of what your role is. And I'll be very honest, if you decide to change that role, grief is going to happen, right? So, for example, if you have been the hero of your family for the very long time, and you finally decide that I'm no more going to kind of take on that role, grief is going to happen. And again, right? So many different things are going to take place. So before we start, I want to show you guys one particular model from PMLD that's about non-chemical addiction, right? So particularly about love addiction, right? And I want to show this model before we start. And if it allows your grief to come up, allow it, right? Allow it, right? If it allows your grief to come up, allow it, right? Like the whole intention is, let's see if our physiologies can tolerate grief, right? Let's see that, right? Can we see grief with not love, but with like not joy also, but as a representation that my body is trying to accept something or accept the change, right? That's what technically grief is, right? Like if I have lost a parent, there's a change that I've gone through just now, right? And what happens is that if I grieve, and which is different from flooding, right? Grief is not flooding, right? If I grieve, then that's my body's representation of accepting the change that's taking place, right? And when after, so even in this particular process, if there's any grief comes up, allow it, right? Really allow yourself to grieve. Sometimes what you will notice is that because we're talking about grief, stuff, unresolved stuff from the past will start to kind of come in and flashback this, right? Because what the body is designed to do is the body is designed to create homeostasis, right? So your body wants to get rid of your suppressed, unresolved changes that it has not accepted so it can finally be at peace, right? However, what happens is that because we haven't really taught or learned how to tolerate grief, it wants to just shove everything out, right? It wants to kind of continue to throw your memories in front of you so that your body kind of overactivates. And that's what really is flooding. This is usually when sometimes clients will come in and they say, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about, I just want to get this out of my chest, right? Because there's such an overwhelm or there's such an intensity about narrating that is associated with grief, right? And so we're going to learn about all of those things. So if something comes up with you while I'm explaining this, allow it. And then I'll show you hopefully how to take it through or how to allow yourself to grieve. Okay. So before Pia Melody. After Pia Melody did the developmental immaturity, another kind of concept she developed is called love addiction. Not all codependents are love addicts, but love addicts are codependents, right? So that's the kind of mindset that she brought in, right? So she says, okay, there's a thing called love addiction, and then there's one thing, and then the other thing is called love avoidant. These are the two people that get into a relationship with each other. Okay. Then what she says is that the love addict, it's a story, so let's go for it, right? So a love addict has a covert, right, fear. There's an overt fear of abandonment, meaning that they are love addicts, right? So what that means is that they don't want to be left alone. They are afraid of that. However, what they actually have is they have a covert fear of intimacy. So they are like, do you love me? 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 Are you sure you love me? Are you sure you love me? You love me? Love me? Love me? Love me? Paka 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 na paka na paka na. Are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? Paka paka paka. And when the guy actually comes or girl actually comes and says, "I love you, I love you, I love you," they go like, "Oh, this is so close. This is just too much. Can't handle that." Right? So that's that. Right? Obviously, I'm caricaturizing it, meaning I'm kind of over dramatizing it, but you will get a picture in your head in terms of what a love addict is, right? That doesn't want to be left alone, but when someone closest to them, they're like, "Zyada ho raha hai," right? That's what a love addict is, right? A love avoidant is the opposite in that end, where they have a covert fear of abandonment, and they have a overt fear of intimacy. So they are like, sit and watch the TV next to me, don't go anywhere. Right? So they are like, I'm not going to have an intimate conversation with you because I can't handle intimacy because of developmental immaturity and all of that stuff. Right? But you're not going to leave, stay. We can't have an intimate talk. हम लोग shopping चलते हैं. हम लोग जो है वो टीवी देखते हैं साथ बात नहीं कर सकते लेट्स नॉट टॉक लेट्स कांट हैंडल टॉक हम लोग घर में टीवी देखते हैं क्या करेंगे और बस टीवी देखेंगे so that's the caricaturized version of what this person is. Okay, so what PM Melody says is that this love addict and love avoidant are hand in glove. The degree of love addict you are, so imagine if the love addict is on the spectrum, right? And here is the addict and here is the avoidant. तो और यहाँ पे वो एक मिडिल चीज है तो जितना आप उस एडिक्ट साइड पे हो आपको उतना ही इंटेंस अवॉइडेंट मिलेगा. So what you start seeing is that you start seeing people who are highly needy, right? Get people who are very high in duty, right? कि वो अपने रिश्ते like उनकी जिम्मेदारी है कि वो आपका ख्याल रखें, right? And all of that stuff. So what happens technically is that the addict, right? So the love addict is in a relationship out of fantasy, knight in shining armor. ये मेरा ख्याल रखेगी. I obviously am caricaturizing, right? Fantasy. There's a whole fantasy that they have that this person is different. ये जो शख्स है ना, they are different. They are different. I'm telling you, they care for me. They love me. They are always there for me. अब देखना वो दूसरों की नहीं सुनता लेकिन मेरा सुनेगा बात. Right? They देख लेना like you know I know dude she is gonna leave everything and she's gonna come with me and that's what's gonna happen. That's what's gonna happen. They're gonna be like this in strong fantasy. And again, there's this whole spectrum of how strong the fantasy can be. Right? There's a whole spectrum here, right? You can go from full blown what was it? What was it? Devdas, right? Like what was he? What was in Devdas, right? So in Devdas, there was this, I forgot the names, right? But there was this main the Ashwarya Rai lady, right? So Ashwarya Rai lady had this fantasy about Shah Rukh Khan that he is gonna leave alcohol for me. Dekh lena wo mujhe chunega and all of that. So there was a whole fantasy she had about who he was, but hey, she was nothing like that. Right. And so there's a whole spectrum there. right? About what a love addict is, right? And there's a whole spectrum there about. So they live in this big fantasy, right? About who they think that the person is. And then what happens is, like all fantasies break. So she realized that Ashwarya Rai character realized that, oh my God, he is not the right person, or whether she chose to realize it or not, or whatever, but the fantasy broke, right? And then what happens is that their fantasy causes a lot of intensity, right? So what happens is this is where the person gets into overwhelm. So overwhelming, right? This is where grief, anger, fear, frustration, all of those things kind of really take place. This is where all the person is kind of going all kind of haywire, right? So they have this fantasy. The fantasy breaks because no person can live up to your fantasy. My wife, right? I have a fantasy about her in terms of, but there is a certain kind of understanding that she's human also, right? That it's not like like for example, I've seen it where, right? I've seen it in a lot of movies and a lot of books. A lot of like Disney has kind of pre-programmed us into thinking that knight in shining armors are going to come, and the archetype of a man is this, and the archetype of a woman in this. And currently in our culture also, like Sas Bahu hasn't been really kind of kind to us as well, where there's been an archetypical kind of fantasy made that the good housewife is someone who has diamonds when she's sleeping, and she kind of wakes up and she's cooked all and she decked in, and this is all fantasy, not real. No one is That's not possible. Fantasies break, you get overwhelmed, and then what happens is there's a spiral starts. You go into the spiral of you go into the spiral of intensity. This is where you start stalking the person, start obsessing over the person. I'm probably spelling it wrong, right? But so you start obsessing over the person. You go like, kya kar raha hoga, kya soch raha hoga, what will he be doing right now? What will she be doing right now? Oh my God, where will they be right now? Are they with this person? Are they with that person? This is what they're doing. This is not what they're doing. This is a whole kind of fantasy and obsession that they're kind of playing in their head. And this is why sometimes when people break up, they start stalking them, right? Like they start Instagramming में उसने मेरा जो है वो 3 घंटे पहले जो है वो लाइक ऑनलाइन था 3 घंटे पहले उसने मुझे अभी तक रिप्लाई नहीं किया. All of that stuff because overt fear of abandonment, covert fear of intimacy. And then what happens is that they either, because of this overt fear of abandonment, they either go back into the same relationship and start the fantasy over again, or they find someone else with a new fantasy. And you would see this cycle kind of continuing, right, in the person. So yeah, so they have this fantasy, they break, they get overwhelmed, they start obsessing, and then they go back to the fantasy. Right? So that's what a love addict cycle is. Now remember, this is one half of the story, right? The other half of the story is the avoidant, hand in glove, right? So what is this glove? They get into a relationship out of duty. And what happens is, no matter how much they try, the duty is never complete. Never enough. Like, never enough. Because they are competing with a fantasy, right? There's no way a fantasy can ever be completed. There will always be something else, right? And because there's a never enough, what happens is that they start getting overwhelmed. And so what they do is they reach their peaks of overwhelm, where they find themselves in grief or in anger or frustration and all of those things, right? And they start going into this overwhelm cycle, right? This is where what they start to do particularly is that they start to look for intensity outside the relationship, right? So this is where they will start going into workaholism. This is where they will start going into cheating. This is where they will start going into extramarital affairs or work or anything that gets them out of this duty, right? But because there is this covert fear of abandonment, they can't leave. And so they go back into the duty with the same person, or they go into a duty with a different person. hand in glove. Okay, अच्छा, इसमें और भी चीजें हैं. So what happens here, right? What happens here is that you can see, right, how the cycle kind of plays out. So that they come into a relationship from a fantasy. Yeah, they're fed up with the duty, 100%, right? So they get fed up with the duty, but because उनको deep down inside abandonment का डर होता है, जिसकी वजह से वो छोड़ के नहीं जाते, right? They can't be alone because they have this covert fear of abandonment. So what they do is that they either kind of after blowing this off, they kind of either go back into the duty, nahi, nahi, acha, I'm sorry, let's go back, or they go back, they go into a different person with they go with a different person with the duty. So the fantasy, so the love addict, right? What happens is they have the strong fantasy, and the love avoidant has the strong duty. Fantasy is never kept, never maintained, never possible to be maintained. The duty is never enough as well. And so what happens is they both go into this cycle of overwhelm. The addict kind of goes into this stalking and obsession over that person. कि कहाँ था, क्या कर रहा था. And this person goes into an avoidance cycle where they are moving away and trying to find intensity outside. So they will go out with friends at night just to avoid the fantasy or the responsibility that's there. यानी कि the husband will be out at night अपने दोस्तों के साथ blowing off some steam, right? Or the wife will go to the salon for 5 hours and like whatever, right? It doesn't really matter. But because there's an overt and a covert abandonment issue, they come back to the same thing. Okay. So what she says is that this is a cycle that continues, right? So this cycle is going this way, this cycle is going this way, and you find your opposite end. What that means is that जिस डिग्री में मैं बैठा हुआ हूँ उस डिग्री में मेरा सामने वाला पार्टनर बैठा हुआ होगा, right? And so you can kind of evaluate based on your own relationships. Acha, there's one more thing here. I can be a love avoidant with men, and I can be a love addict with women. I can be a love addict with men, and I can be a love. So gender does play a part, right? So for example, if and I'll tell you why it plays a part also, right? So for example, if I was to evaluate for my own self, I am an avoidant, right? So I'm an avoidant with men, and technically I'm an avoidant with women. And so what happens is that in the past, technically, when I was like super hyper avoidant, right? So people who I would get into relationships with would be have super high fantasy, right? And so the more you kind of work on yourself, the more you can figure the stuff out for yourself also, right? कि अच्छा अगर मैं avoidant हूँ तो क्या सामने वाले शख्स के अंदर fantasy बहुत ज्यादा है in terms of what their expectation is than in terms of what I can do, and I'm always trying to fulfill them, or is it in reverse? You can really start to evaluate what this is. Okay, why and where does all of this come from? Where is the grief, right? Where is the grief? If this is my story of how I get into relationships, where is this coming from? And not surprisingly, it comes from our parents, right? What happens is that we have the male and we have the female, right? The mother and the father. My father, as a boy, teaches me about men unconsciously by the age of 3. My mother teaches me about women, right? And their relationship teaches me about what attachment and what relationships are. And all of these are being wired into my brain much before I can even properly, coherently express all of these things, right? These are all neurological systems that are being kind of developed. So what happens is that as a boy, if I have a father that is not present, looking away, okay, so then what happens is I have this strong need to be like, come with me, please. Where are you? Can you be there for me? I want to be there for you. Can you hold me, please? So there's this need that's there because of them being neglectful. That, according to PM Melody, is what really causes us to have that kind of wounding, because enmesh and neglect are both abuses. That causes us to have that wounding for us to have that develop that fantasy, because there is an abandonment in childhood, right? Because of this, there is this thing that as a man, if my father isn't there, or as a man, my mother isn't there, I would be love addict towards men or women based on the gender. Okay. If my parents' gender, which whatever parent, right, is, and you can view for whatever gender also, and you can kind of figure this stuff out, right, is enmeshed. What that means is that they are using me for their own needs, right? So enmeshed doesn't mean attuned, right? Enmeshed means that if enmeshed का मतलब है कि मैं empty हूँ, मैं insecure हूँ और मुझे अच्छा लगता है जब मैं उसका ख्याल रखती हूँ तो मुझे अच्छा लगता है. Right? So there is this selfish need that's kind of being fulfilled from this, right? So what happens is that because of that intensity, you start going into like this avoidance cycle. Oh, too much, too much, too much. Can't handle this shit. Right? And this is not attunement, right? This is not love. This is not coming from a genuine space of attunement. This is coming from a space of enmeshment, right? Where you're kind of smothering the child because you feel incomplete without the child, right? That's where that is, right? And so what Pia Melody says is that this is where the wounding really comes from, right? Where you can when you have neglect as parenting, right? You can really start noticing signs of love addiction kind of form within the person because there is still that unmet need and desire that's there. And when you have enmeshment, you notice signs of love avoiding kind of forming, right? And these are all pre kind of 4 years old. And these are all the woundings that kind of takes place there. Okay. This is what that is. Okay. Now what happens? Right? Like now what happens? Now what happens is that this person starts to realize that this is what's happening with them. And this is just a model of treatment, right? This is just what they say, right? Okay, this person starts to go to therapy and they're like, okay, I did not realize that this is what was happening to me, that because my mother was neglectful, I I have this hope that there would be a person that would actually take care of me, right? And they realize this stuff, right? And so the what happens is that at this stage, right? I hope this is clear, right? Because at this stage, what happens is that once this understanding or language has happened, there is this sort of like readiness, hopefully, to change, right? There is this readiness to change. Imagine if someone wants to kind of do the work in therapy. Once they get through this, because today is about grief, right? Once they get through this, right, they start seeing, okay, I have these kind of expectations from my wife that she would take care of me because that was either the enmeshment or the avoidance that was there in my childhood. Okay. You can see the fantasy kind of being there. And so once it's realized, once this awareness hits, and what happens with talk therapy particularly is that a lot of people are able to reach a form of awareness, right? They're able to reach a form of awareness through the talk, through the awareness, through the Socratic questioning, through the technical stuff. You reach awareness. Awareness reaching is not the issue. What is the issue sometimes is that now what? Right now what? Now that I've understood all of this stuff, now what happens? Right? And then you kind of realize that now you grieve or you kind of allow your body to learn or teach how to grieve. Right? And what you start assuming is that you have these kind of assumptions people have about what grieving is, what grieving looks like, and all of those things. But and that's sort of like what the whole purpose of today is to really clean this up. Grief technically has nothing to do with the memory, because technically what they were able to realize is this is the present for them. If you were to kind of use this basis, is the present for them. The present was that they were in a relationship, right? They were stuck in a relationship that was out of fantasy. Imagine a client is doing this and we're using this to case conceptualize, right? And what they realized that they had this past in which their parents were like neglectful, abandoning, right? And you're able to kind of map this out with the client. कि अच्छा यार ये हो रहा है और ये हो रहा था, right? जिसकी वजह से आज का ये experiences हैं, psychodynamic in nature and all of those things, right? अब awareness हो गई, बात कर लिया इसके बारे में, right? So does that mean that the grief is done? No. Just because you have awareness doesn't mean you're present to your body, right? Because there is this amazing defense mechanism technically called dissociation. There's another issue that comes in with grief, right? Another issue that comes in with grief is that grief usually comes in at a bad time, right? So what that means is that my body's learning or memory of grief is always that grief, I'm sad when things are bad, right? So my body wants to kind of really avoid grief because every time I have gone through something sad, it's always been a bad thing, right? So what that means is that I technically don't want to intentionally evoke grief because what in the way it works is that my memory, right, is categorized in files like chunks. That's how memories are categorized. They're categorized in chunks. So what that means is that if I was to connect to a memory of sadness, that file opens up with all the memories of sadness. Okay. If I connect to a memory of anger, that file opens up with all the memories of anger. That's how the brain key memory is wired. They're not wired like sequentially. There's no unconscious memory of time. They're wired emotionally. So emotional files बने हुए होते हैं आपके memory के cabinet के अंदर. So for example, if you are remembering the time when your husband kind of was, what do you call it? Gair Zimmedar is a good like Gair Zimmedar. You will notice frustration and anger, and your memory catalog will open up all the times that they were Gair Zimmedar. Right? That's how the brain is supposed to work, right? It's categorized in that manner. It's not categorized timeline नहीं बना हुआ होता कि 25th January को उसने ये किया था फिर 30th January को हुआ. It's not timeline नहीं होता. It's categorized in emotions and stuff. So that's how the brain works. So what happens is that when you're going to grieve, you have to know that that's how it's going to work, right? As soon as you open up the file of grieving, that means that the memories associated with grieving are all going to chunk up, right? And they're all there waiting to kind of flood out, right? So this is something that I also learned that, and again, I figured this out. I didn't figure this out. The way I experienced this was that when I watched a sad movie, because that's my way of grieving, right? I watch a sad movie. I have the right movie for it. So yeah, so anytime I feel like I have to emote, right? And I can't figure this out because grieving is supposed to be in like it sometimes it's like you get dissociated, right? That old habits of dissociations come back. And you know that you have to grieve because you've gone through some really life change. And so you want to kickstart the process. So I started watching this kind of movie. Novels is a good, movie is good. I have like these kind of addiction movies you start watching and you start like bawling, right? And as soon as you start bawling, right, and वो finally वो tap खुल जाता है, that's when you start to like all these other thoughts start to come in, and then you're like, technically, I'm no more grieving about the movie. I'm technically grieving about all the stuff that it's reminding me of, and sure, right, that's one way. It's just as long, and this is something that I kind of tell, as long as you are present in your body while you're doing it, right? Because what can happen is that as soon as the memory flood opens up, right, your body, it can actually regress back to that time, right? So, for example, what can happen is, and that's what re-traumatization is, right? This is what trauma processing is all about, right? So, what happens is if I connect to the emotion, I have not connected to a memory. If I connect to the emotion, what happens is that my memories start to like pile up. But if I go into the memory and I start talking about the memory, and what can happen is that I can start reliving the memory rather than remembering it. And my nervous system and my body will act like the same age as if it was when it was actually happening. And that could have been like 30 years ago. It's called regression, right? It's one of the most amazing regression. There's these nervous system patterns that are there, and that's what you want to avoid. You want to avoid that stuff, right? You don't want your client to grieve in the past. You want the client to grieve in the present, right? So that they can allow a release to happen rather than a reliving to take place. That is technically the technical thing about grief. And I think it's the most like Yeah. It's the most possible thing. It just requires, the thing is, what it requires is a sense of understanding the science behind the mechanics, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why I really kind of enjoyed the trauma informed stuff, the EMDR stuff, is because जब आप trauma processing को समझते हो, right? कि अच्छा trauma process कैसे होता है, right? Then you understand कि अच्छा it's not through the memory or re-narrating the memory that you are processing it, right? What happens is कि आपका जो current present experience है, right, that and your stimulus, right, which is your memory, that has to become acceptable. Let me give you an example, right? Well, let's just take this one. So imagine that when this client was going through this experience, in order to bear the neglect, they had to dissociate. That means they had to numb some of the feelings. Jais, absolutely Jais. Like that's probably the way this arrived, right? Jais. Now that they've had this experience of therapy, that they learned कि अच्छा यार ये मेरे साथ हुआ था, right? Now what's going to happen is that their experience or their stored dissociation is going to come up. So when they start grieving, how do you kind of set them up? What you tell them is that grief is something that's present in the body, right? It's not in the memory, it's not in the past. What you will notice is that you will notice like a sensation in your body. You will notice like a heaviness in your chest. You will notice like a lump in your throat. You might notice your eyes kind of swell up, right? You might notice that there's a desire to cry, right? And these are all appropriate responses for your body to show that it's learning to accept what happened, right? And so what you do is you help the client become more informed about, अच्छा, okay, this is what's happening. पता है मेरे साथ क्या हुआ था? मेरे साथ जो है ना वो 6-7 साल, मैं जब 6 साल का था तो मेरे साथ मेरी जो माँ थे वो उसने जो है मुझे ये बात नहीं की थी। उसके बाद उसने बात जो है कभी कभी मैं जो हूँ दावत में जाता था, दावत में भी मुझसे वो बात नहीं करती थी क्योंकि उनको हमेशा अपनी बिजी थे। Okay. That is called a wall of words, right? What that is doing is that it's helping them, protecting them from connecting to the physiology. Okay. Because at this age, they did not have any resources, right? At this age, they did not have any resources, right? And remember, we talked about how the mind can regress back and it can go back into the old physiology. And so what happens is that's one of the reasons why this person sitting in front of you is not of that age. This person is young, doesn't have resources. This person is old and has resources because this is the person that figured this stuff out. Okay. Now, what your job is as a therapist to help them grieve is that your job is to anchor them. कि जहां वो दोबारा उस regressive habits में जा रहे हैं, आप उनको बोलो, let's pause. Okay. Are you able to connect to the sensations that are present in your body? Okay. And that again will only happen, and this is the first few sessions, if you are able to do so. If you have not done your own grief work, and if you are avoiding some grief, and it's not easy, I just want to be very honest, like ऐसा नहीं है कि like this is super easy and you can grieve like some bad events that have happened in your life. It's not that easy, right? Like, but this is what it takes, right? Because if you're dissociated, remember we talked about psychodynamics and all of that stuff, उसके अंदर यही सब था. If you're dissociated and you're split from the dissociation, you will never be able to get the client through their grief, even though what you're talking about is the event itself, right? You could be talking about the event, but because you haven't resolved your own grief stuff and they are not associated with the grief, you can be like, they could be flooding and crying and not pretending, they can be flooding and crying, but they could be doing that for session after 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 session, right? And there's no real grieving happening because technically How do you know if the client is grieving through the process or if it's not grieving through the process, right? How do you know all of this stuff? Okay, is it working? Is it not working? Right? We're allowing our body to connect. We're staying away from the memory. We're really allowing our body to feel it. We're breathing through the emotions rather than just like suppressing, right? Because sometimes you will notice that the breath is held. Sometimes you will notice that the body is kind of really restricted, and you have to be really mindful of all of these things. And the reason why you're able to be attuned and pick it up is because you've learned how to breathe while you cry. That's what it is, right? Making it safe, right? You're building this association that not every time I cry is bad, right? You're building this association that crying is me accepting the changes that are happening in my life. That's what crying is, right? And it's my body's way of doing so. So how can you tell as a therapist, is it working? Is it not working? Are you stuck in grief, or is this kind of like consistently going through? Grief, luckily, has stages, and it's not direct. It's not direct, but these are some of the stages that can happen. It has obviously denial, right? That's when you're going to find the most resistance. You're going to notice dissociation the most. You're going to notice the client kind of talk, but monotone, right? No, absolutely no, like emotional मेरे साथ पता है क्या होता है मेरे साथ ये हुआ था फिर 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 मेरे साथ ये हुआ फिर ये हुआ फिर मेरी मम्मी ने ये बोला मेरे साथ ये बोला बोला no emotional attunement. That technically is the client flooding really badly, right? There's this kind of like assumption कि flooding जो होता है ना वो सिर्फ like big explosive like cry, super angry, super sad, like big explosion is a flood. No, dissociativeness is also a flood, right? You could be completely checked out in your body and have this kind of dead eye, monotone kind of thing. And the therapist thinks like, oh, it's great, man. This person is at least crying. It's not true. This is dissociation as well. This is flooding also. It's just the other spectrum where there's nothing there, right? And you have to be really mindful because it tells you information about how did the client protect themselves when they were young also, right? So it's all of those things that are there. Okay, so first stage is denial. Second is anger. A lot of people confuse anger for like this process, right? Because anytime a client is angry, or sometimes you want to be curious, is the client grieving something? You want to ask yourself this question. If any time the client is showing, I'm really angry at my mother, I'm really angry at my father, it makes sense, right? It'll make sense because considering the history that would have been there, it would make sense for there to be anger. But is it anger or is it grieving a stage? So you want to ask yourself that question. And what it does is it helps you link up the therapeutic work very good, right? Because you're sort of like in the middle right now. If you're gonna get lost in denial, anger is not the main work, right? Anger could be part of the grieving process. But if you get stuck in anger, कि आपको अच्छे अपने father पे क्यों गुस्सा है? किस वजह से गुस्सा है? क्या मसला है आपका? क्या है ये चीज? And if you don't ask that question, कि are you grieving your relationship with your father? You're not really going into the work. That could be information about your own experiences also, right? So you want to be aware of that stuff. Bargaining, gosh, gosh, gosh this, gosh that, gosh mere paas, gosh wo, gosh ye kar sakta tha, gosh wo ho sakta tha. This is where the grief is almost like ready, right? Because they have stopped that fight that kind of happens, right? Then you have, it's called depression, but I think you can even call it sadness. This is when your body actually starts to release the emotions, right? This is where sort of like this is where if I was to kind of write down about emotional intensity, this is where the client is almost speaking, right? This is where you as a therapist have to stay quite regulated. You don't have to be afraid of them crying. Can't be afraid of them crying. You have to allow them to release whatever is it in their body that needs to be released. If they want to cry, let them cry. There's nothing wrong with crying. As long as they can breathe while they cry, no problem. Absolutely no problem. You want to cry, you cry. The only difference is the cry is like, you know what hichkiya leke rona is? Hichkiya leke rona is technically gasping for air, right? That means that the body is above the range of tolerance in a full shutdown mode, completely relapsed and completely re-experiencing the process. What technically needs to happen is that as you're crying, as you're grieving, right, you're actually allowing, yeah, healthy, right? Like you're actually allowing the body to kind of reassociate itself with sadness and breathe. And you cry and you cry and you cry. And what you're doing is all that stored energy and emotions that were in the body that weren't released at this stage, they finally get a chance to release. Finally. And you will be surprised on how powerful and how quick the shift happens. It's just that the therapist can't be scared. That's the issue. Right? The therapist can't be scared. Oh my God, they're reaching such a high intensity of emotions. If you can see that they're breathing, and that will only happen if you're breathing, right? You will be able to take a client through it. So sadness is healthy? Yes, absolutely. Sadness is amazingly healthy. And how much period of sadness is okay? Right. So technically, the only reason why the sadness gets stuck is because it hasn't gotten a chance to release safely. Right. So, for example, and there are other reasons also, which I'll kind of go into as well in terms of why it doesn't get released safely. Right. So, technically, you have denial, anger, bargaining, then you have acceptance, where you're finally able to kind of say, you're able to kind of really kind of acknowledge and tolerate. And technically, at this stage, you're able to almost revisit the memory without overwhelm. Technically, that's what it is. When you're reaching acceptance, for example, in this particular example regarding this whole situation, okay, the person, client, will be able to talk about their past without it actually evoking the same intensity of anger. They don't have to like it, but it's not evoking the same intensity of anger because they have finally grieved it, which is allowing them to reach a sense of acceptance. Yeah, absolutely. These are not binary at nature, right? Like you can have acceptance and sadness together. For example, if I have gone through, how do I say this? If I've gone through abuse, right? I'm sad about my abuse, man. I'm not gonna, never gonna be happy about it, right? कि मेरे साथ ये हुआ, right? But I can reach a sense of acceptance of it that I can actually talk about it without it creating the same reliving or re-traumatizing that it can kind of happen. And that stage is called meaning making. And this is a very kind of precarious stage. You have to reach it appropriately because this stage can't be bypassed into. Allah ki marzi thi is not the right stage. This is not meaning making. Allah ki marzi thi is not meaning making. Right? You have to be really mindful about this, right? That you're not bypassing anything, right? Because again, could be denial, right? Because you're using your therapeutic judgment. You're not saying कि यार अच्छा client बोल रहा है कि अल्लाह की मर्जी थी इसका मतलब है कि हाँ थी. But in actuality, their physiology, their facial features, their body language kind of shows that they're super dissociated, right? So they technically haven't reached Allah ki marzi thi properly, lack of a better word, right? Genuinely. So this is what's important here, right? That you can kind of reach that sense of meaning making eventually. This is what PTG is called. Post traumatic growth happens here, right? So, for example, if I've gone through some things in my life, I've genuinely, like, when I look back at it, they give me like this kind of somber memory. It's not like, wow, my sath bullying hui thi, amazing, amazing. No, like, oh, there's nothing like that. It's sadness, but there's an acceptance. And with whatever pepper and salt is in it, I understand that now I am technically a stronger person because of those experiences that have happened. Allah, yeah, so many call us Allah. So many people called sorted people are called are Allah ki mercy. Yeah, right. So what will be more meaning making than Allah ki mercy? But you have to reach it from a place of presence, right? There's nothing wrong when reaching Allah ki mercy thi, right? But अगर आप genuinely बोल रहे हो, right? Like for example, what I'm trying to say is that in my experience, what I've seen is that people bypass sadness, right? Because अगर अल्लाह की मर्जी थी भी चलो, right? When you talk about it, does it flood you or not? Right? That is the difference. Does it flood you? Right? क्या आप अभी like flood करते हो, यानी कि अभी भी वो charge है उस चीज का, इसका मतलब है कि वो आपके body से पूरा grieve नहीं हुआ है. Right? So what I'm trying to say is that Allah ki marzi can also be a like in this is not technically meaning making because technically you're in denial, right? And so you want to use your therapeutic judgment to realize that what is really taking place here, right? Is the person kind of saying, "Ah, Allah ki marzi thi ho jata hai, koi masla nahi hai." Is it denial because they are in avoidance of their grief because the grief reminds them of their past and the past is super painful, right? Or when they talk about it, you genuinely notice presence in them, that they're breathing, that they're relaxed, their eye muscles and facial muscles are in ventral, they're genuine in that kind of space, and you're like, yeah, yeah, makes sense, you know? The idea is not to doubt the client, right? The idea is to understand, does it use your own body? Does it feel congruent? Right? And only again, session number one, session number two, session number three, only when you are congruent will you be able to attune to these things because these kind of therapeutic judgments can only come up if you're attuned. What if they are dissociative? 95%, yeah, they are going to be, right? And so, again, assuming that you are not dissociative, right? And assuming that you have done your grief work, what you do is yet you model titration. What does that mean? So titration is, for example, let me kind of give you an example here, right? So talk therapy, what it does is it says, and we've talked about the memory wala part, right? In memory ka ek category hota hai. So yeah, so let me just kind of go through this. How do you feel about people prematurely pushing forgiveness for the abusers in society? Yeah. Is this a collective lack of attunement or for our society? Maaf kar do, yeah, 100%, man. Right? Like, this is technically what happens when the family doesn't believe the abused, right? Like what happens in trauma culture, right? Like what happens in trauma culture is that because the family finds it hard to tolerate the reality because they haven't done their own grief, they want to bypass and goes like, "Maaf kar do, maaf." Like, and again, we are again a traumatized society, right? Which means that we can't collectively grieve. We flood, right? There's no concept of healthy grieving in a traumatized society because it's all bypassing, dissociative, all of that stuff, right? And we want to really and trauma healing in a nutshell is learning how to grieve again, right? And grieve isn't a bad thing. It's something so important. And as a therapist, you have to be like super proficient in seeing someone cry and accepting it, not intruding because oh my god usko रोना आ रहा है, not saying कि oh my god जब तक वो रोएगा नहीं तब तक वो सही नहीं हो सकता. It's not, none of these extremes have to be there. It is, you're technically aware of when this stage is supposed to happen, what is required of this person to actually get through it, and you're not stuck in this whole process of I've heard therapists say कि जब तक उसको रुलाया नहीं तब तक मजा नहीं आया session में. And I was like, oh my God, right? That's not the purpose here, right? The purpose isn't to make the client cry. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to help the client understand what does it take to reach acceptance, genuine acceptance in their body, right? And what it takes is grieving, right? And what if the client is dissociative, and which could mean that they could just be talking about the event and not grieving, or completely like shut down and not interested. And what you do is you tell the client, देखें, हम अगर ग्रीफ के ऊपर अभी हम लोग काम करने जा रहे हैं तो क्या होगा कि आपकी सारी मेमोरीज जो है ना वो ग्रीफ से फाइल्ड है. ओके, हमें क्या करना है कि हमें उस शेल्फ के सामने खड़ा रह के उस फोल्डर को देखना है बगैर निकाले. That's it. That's all we want to do. We want to be able to look at that book or at that folder without taking it out and opening up the chapters and finding out what are all the stuff in it. That's it. That's the first. We will go and open up the chapter and read all the stuff, but we don't want to get overwhelmed by it, right? You want to do it safely. So we're just going to sit in front of this bookshelf, right, where all your memories are stored categorically, emotion by emotion. And जो grief का जो category है, उसको हम सब देख रहे हैं. Can we do that right now? Okay. As you're noticing this file that it is in front of you, and it has all the pages, it has all the written memory in it, what are you noticing in your body? Right? And what you will notice is that the client will titrate. Titrate का मतलब है that they will feel it for a bit, right? And you have to be like really alert here, right? Really alert. You have to be really present as a therapist. They will feel it, right? अब दो चीजें हो सकती हैं. They will either go back to dissociation or they will go into numbing, right? What would be required in, it's a good question, right? What would be required in a collective society where people in is enmeshed with each other? Yes, right. How can we talk about grieving and accepting, keeping it cultural context in mind? Good question. It's all seems like almost one person is grieving, everyone else in the family needs to participate, and yeah, for codependency, right? Thoughts about which or have some thoughts which can murk waters because in grieving process we are a little extra sensitive, or yes, 100%. Right. So that's one of the reasons why we're sharing sort of like this information first. Now, I just bought this book that I'm not a grieving person. Liberty Kender currently available. Right. I'm not a grieving person. And that's what, and the only thing that you can do currently is model. Right. That's the only thing that you can do, in my opinion. Because collective change requires a lot of people collectively doing the same thing, right? Our intention of doing the therapist training program, having this information, you modeling this information, doing it for yourself, and then doing it for your clients is what's going to create, in my opinion, collective change, right? Because when more people know how to grieve properly, there's safety in it, there's trauma healing in it, right? And this is what the whole intention is. So I'm hoping that kind of answers, right? So what happens with this particular client is that you have to learn how to titrate. Peter Levine calls it pendulation also, right? And titration as well. So what it means is that आप इस client के साथ attuned हो, you're teaching the client how to grieve without activating past memory. So what you've told them is that let's just look at the bookshelf without going into and taking it out. You might feel the compulsion to take it out, and like because you've always every time you've seen that folder, you've taken it out. It's muscle memory. So we're not going to take it out. We're just going to look at it. We're going to notice the emotions that come up. And then when you notice that the client dissociated, talked about it, or flooded, started to overwhelm, what you're going to do is you're going to stop, pause. You're going to regulate. So for example, if the client is dissociated, you're going to do interoceptive body awareness based regulation. If the client is flooded, you're going to pause them, help them breathe, help them regulate, and then you're going to start again. And this time, what you're going to notice is that they will be able to go a little bit further, right? And then what's going to happen is that then the muscle memory is going to kick back in and they might dissociate again and they might kind of flood again, and then you're going to stop again. And then you're going to go it again. And this time, what you will notice is that their body is learning that it is safe for them to be sad without going too much into that depressive flood state or wanting to protect themselves and coming out of it by dissociating. That they can reach, the middle hota hai na, middle. They can stay in that middle without losing themselves. And what that does is that it rewires the brain. It rewires the brain. It helps the client now be sad about the process without dissociating and flooding. And that is the time where they can actually open the file. Because now they have this technique available where they can actually grieve what is written in those pages, right? As compared to dissociating and flooding what they did to manage it. right? And that is very important. That is very important. And that can only happen when the therapists themselves can actually go through it. Can you explain titration process a little more in terms of the flooding, for instance? Yes. Okay. So, for example, titration is very important, right? Because, and this is not just for grief. This titration process can be for anger also. It can be for fear also, right? It's up, but two things are required: attunement, right? Attunement and congruence, right? The therapist needs to know that ये जो डिसोसिएट कर रहा है वो जेन्युइन कर रहा है, आप डिसोसिएट नहीं कर रहे, आप फ्लड नहीं, आपको फ्लडिंग से डर नहीं लग रहा, राइट? लाइक यू हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड दैट you have to be sorted enough to be able to do this work. It's as simple as that, right? And so what happens is that what titration is that you're teaching this client how to grieve without flooding or dissociating. What is flooding? What is dissociating? Flooding and dissociating is that the client's memory flashes back because their physiology is similar to what they had experienced in the past. So, for example, in this example, because this client experienced the sadness or numbness or was flooding, as soon as they started to evoke this memory, their body went back into the same physiology. And that's what you don't want. Trauma processing is all about changing the way you are remembering that experience in the present moment. Okay. And how does the therapist do that? The therapist becomes the anchor for the client. What the therapist does is the therapist attunes to the client and teaches them how to evoke the grief in their physiology. Once the grief is evoked, they are attuned कि अच्छा client कितना देर इस grief के अंदर रह सकता है बगैर dissociate हुए या flood किए हुए. Flood का मतलब they start crying without breathing. They like, no, you're like, you really feel it in the room that they're gone, right? That they are just wailing is sometimes the word. They start closing their eyes. They start like their body starts to shrink. They start to kind of, they start pressing their tear ducts also. वो tear ducts press करना शुरू कर देते हैं. उनका जो है वो गला, they start to really kind of squeeze their lungs and their shoulders and all of that stuff. This is the body going into an overwhelmed state, right? And what you do is you help them. And that can only happen if you're staying relaxed. And in that relaxed state, you tell them, it's all right. Just breathe. Okay? And you're using your body to co-regulate so that they come to a pause. Simple. And what you've taught their physiology is that they can come out of flooding and they can come out. They don't need these exclusively. They don't need these kind of mechanisms or protective. These are protective mechanisms, right? Like you don't need that stuff. You can still have it and we're going to use it, right? So you can pause. And so it's sometimes really good to also talk about this. If you notice like a dissociation happening or if you notice like a flooding taking place, is there any way that you've kind of stopped yourself from feeling? Right? What's the best way? Like, so for example, if someone floods, you can say, have you dissociated ever in your feelings? You can actually use dissociation as a resource also in this situation. And there's like whole list of things. Once you really taught the client and you really genuinely feel that they can actually grieve, then is the right time to talk about it because then you can give it meaning. Because you've actually completed the sadness wala phase. Your body has released the sadness, and sometimes it's quick because by the time that the clients are coming in, they're really ready to kind of do the work. Sometimes it will take time, right? And there is no rush. Your body will be sad for as long as it needs to be sad for, right? That's the thing. There is no kind of like your body wants to feel better than you want it to feel better, right? So it's not like आपका body ज़्यादा देर sad में रहेगा if it doesn't need to be there. No, it's not going to stay in sadness if it doesn't need to be there. If it is sadness for whatever time frame, that means that there is a reason for it, right? And that's where sort of like the second kind of part really comes in. I hope this is understandable in terms of a technique, in terms of titration. I have one more technique after this as well. I'll share that with you guys. Right, so this is titration, right? I hope this was kind of helpful. I've always been very proponent of what the therapist needs to do for themselves, stages of therapy, all of those things, okay? What happens is that how long is sadness appropriate for? Right? That's a very good question. Right? Yeah, kitni der? How long does this process take? Trust the body, right? The body technically knows. So, for example, if someone loses a parent, hypothetically, okay, some people might be grieving for 5 days, some people might be grieving for 5 years, right? What's the difference? What's the difference when it comes to time, right? Because the body's mechanism is the same. Okay. So for this, you got to understand relationship of emotion and memory. Okay. So technically, like I mentioned, मेमोरीज जो है वो इमोशनल फाइल होती हैं राइट उनकी जो फाइलिंग है वो थ्रू इमोशंस होती है क्लस्टर्स बने हुए होते हैं राइट तो देयर आर दीस क्लस्टर्स समटाइम्स देयर इमोशंस समटाइम्स देयर टॉपिक्स एंड इवेंट्स राइट बट द क्लस्टर्स बने हुए होते हैं अब व्हाट हैपेंस इज दैट sometimes emotions become a good way to keep those memories. Okay, for example, if I lost a family member, okay, if I lost a family member, right? And I'm sad about it. I'm grieving. I'm flooding. I'm sad about it. Because every time I get sad, I remember them. Because that's how the brain works, right? वो मैंने फाइल खोला, फाइल में उनका नाम लिखा हुआ है. कभी भी मुझे उनका नाम देखना है, मैंने फाइल खोला, मैंने नाम लिखा, right? So what happens is there is sometimes this secondary gain. Sometimes it's really hard to accept that we have lost the person. Really hard. And again, I want to be very mindful, right? That there's no ill intention here, right? Like, for example, if I have lost a child, hypothetically, right? If I have lost a child, right? And I know that anytime I get sad unconsciously, right? Anytime I want to remember that child, I get sad, right? Or anytime I'm sad, I can remember that child, right? And मेरे दिमाग में वो association, क्योंकि this is how my brain categorizes memory, वो association बना हुआ है, right? And so there is this unconscious fear that if I let go of my sadness, will I let go of that child? Which has already kind of passed away. So there's already that layer there, right? And so you want to be really mindful of that secondary gain, respectful also, right? Because you have to have empathy, right? That no one is doing this with ill intent, right? अगर मैं भी अपने आप को कभी कभी सोचता हूँ यार कि अगर मुझे ये सब इंफॉर्मेशन नहीं पता होती, राइट? और मेरे दिमाग में जब मैं अगर फॉर एग्जांपल खुदा ना खास्ता if I lose a child and I feel sad, right? Because that's the first intense emotion that comes up for me, right? And anytime I have this emotion with me, I can always remember that child, and I've already lost them. I'll never want to let that go, right? Especially if I was like angry or stuff like that, I would never want to let that go, right? And so you have to be very respectful of understanding that their reason for holding on to that sadness has a very genuine purpose, right? That it has a very genuine purpose, and that you as a therapist understand and respect it. Your job is not to take away their second connection with their kid, hypothetically. Your job is to give them an option that were there any good memories and happy memories also, right? Can we change the filing from sad to happy? Might be a strong shift, but like hopeful, right? So one of the things that you kind of ask them is, tell me more about that person. What was your best memory about that person? She or she sounds like a really good person. Did they have any quirks? Right? Did they have any quirks? You know how some people have quirks that they make these kind of weird jokes. Did they make those weird jokes? Like, what was their quirk? Right? But again, has to be done with lots of respect. Right? Even if you use humor, whatever your style is, respect. You can't lose that respect, right? Because if you are, oh my God, I'm the ultimate savior and I'll help them and I'll help them get through their grief because I can't tolerate my own grief and all of that stuff, not gonna work. Not gonna work, right? Be very mindful of your rescuer. Be very mindful of your codependency. None of this shit's gonna work because if they think that you're there to take away, and that's true for addiction also, right? That you're there to take away their one last connection to whatever this relationship is, not gonna work, right? But if they think that you're there to just attune and understand and all of those things, it's gonna be appropriate, right? Is there no happy memories? Then what do we do? Not possible, right? Like, I'll be very honest, like, until unless, like, so technically, that no happy memories is a defense mechanism, right? Because what that statement will do is like, happy memories to Haini, right? Don't take this away from me right now. That's what they're saying. Technically, that's what they're saying. Don't take this memory away from me, right? What that means is not enough resources, right? And so you go like, my bad. I'm not going to fight them in terms of like, नहीं ऐसा हो ही नहीं सकता आपको आपके बेटे के साथ या बच्चे के साथ या माँ बाप के साथ कोई ना कोई तो हैप्पी मेमोरी होगी no matter how shitty your parent was, right, or how shitty your life was, कोई ना कोई तो happy memory होगी. Like, I'm not going to argue with them then, right, but I'm going to pick this up as information that says too soon, just too soon. It was just too, it was a too, my move was too soon, right? That means I was trying to get them to get there faster than they were ready for. What that also means is my need. That means in order, if I was doing it too soon, that means mujhe unse zyada jaldi hai. That also means that there's something that I can't tolerate about this whole situation. That means I could be avoiding some grief also, which I need to take to my supervision. But you can see, right, how much information you can get, from these kind of questions and answers if you have that kind of mindset. And what it will do is it will help you improve your attunement. Like, as long as आपने अपने ego को in check में रखा हुआ है, it will help you attune so well to the client, and it will help you attune so much to the client that you will be able to, because they will only do it when they're ready. They will only come out of grief when they're ready. That is a fact, right? मतलब कोई भी आपको मुझे उनको डिप्रेशन से नहीं निकाल सकता, right? The only time they will be able to get out of it is once they understand how to titrate. That's one tool, right? They understand the concept of secondary gain appropriately at the right time, right? They have this understanding of अच्छा मेरे files इस तरह होते हैं, मैं इस तरह इसको cabinet change कर सकता हूँ, कर सकती हूँ. That's another one, right? So all of these different kind of options becomes available for them. I think the alternate option in the case is for the person who's passed away was the cause of the pain of the client. Then we focus on growth and how do we feel different. And so how do we feel different and how things have been since then. So again, right? So risky here again. For example, if it was an abuser that died, hypothetically, right? Like imagine it in the reverse, right? Like it's not a positive person that passed away, it's a negative person that passed away, hypothetically, right? And the thing is, the grief then isn't about the person dying, right? The grief technically is still about the wounding and the childhood, right? And so you can't bypass that stuff. I hope that's clear, right? You can't bypass that stuff, right? Like you cannot bypass in any way, because all of these things, right, in terms of how it could have been different, how positive, all of this would bypass, right? Because technically, if it's a negative person that has passed away and you're noticing grief kind of come up, so what that means is that technically the grief would not be about the person itself. It's about the loss of childhood or whatever that stuff is. So you can't jump and focus on the person dying, because that's not what really the problem is also, especially if it's a negative person that passed away, right? It's actually about what they lost because of that person, right? And so you've got to be able to deduct that stuff, right? And that only happens, when you read books, when you kind of understand कि अच्छा यार, what is the client really saying to me when they are sad about their abuser dying, right? What is they really trying to say? Are they trying to say that they're sad about the abuser dying? Are they trying to say that they're sad about the experience that they had to go through because of that abuser, and that's gone? So what are they really grieving, right? And that all of that stuff, all of that work, right? All of that assessments and intervention thinking that kind of takes place, it's happening because of your attunement, right? And it's so important, man. I cannot differentiate that the art of therapy, like the finesse of therapy, is all about your attunement, right? And that's one of the reasons why in the start, like the first few days, we talked about this stuff in like so much detail, because you can only do this level of work if you are able to be with the client, राइट दैट्स इट यू एबल टू आपको ये सब इंफॉर्मेशन कि यार ये सेकेंडरी गेन भी होता है स्टेजेस ऑफ थेरेपी भी होते हैं टाइट्रेशन भी होता है बैक एंड इंफॉर्मेशन राइट आपके दिमाग में ये सब आपको पता है पहले से राइट बट द रियल वर्क इज राइट कि व्हाट इज रियली हैपनिंग हियर विद मी राइट नाउ right and this relationship will give you all the information that you need, and if it's a really healthy one you can really inquire and ask questions about it a lot more also, right? So those are some of the elements that are kind of there, and I do think that grief is like the everyone's going to go through it. Number one, because everyone is going to go through change, right? Number two, every therapist I think has to be very proficient in understanding grief, very proficient, because if you understand like how memory works in trauma, and if you understand like how the grief system works and how you kind of help person regulate their emotions or release stored emotions, ये सब इसमें involved है, right? Secondary gain क्या होता है? For example, anger. Let's अभी तो हम लोग बहुत ज्यादा grief के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं, but this same mechanism can be used for any emotion, right? So there could be secondary gains about anger, जिसकी वजह से the client is consistently stuck in anger, right? Depression, right? There's secondary gain about depression. If I don't try, then I won't fail, right? Like आप मुझे जितना भी बोल दो, लेकिन as long as I know for a fact that if I don't try, I won't fail, right? And so you have to have that patience, and that's where the art of therapy comes in, which is all this stuff, right? Like in grieving work, the most important thing is the client has to really feel safe with you, and you have to really be feel safe with the content or the scope of the work. Okay. So one more tool I wanted to give before we kind of end today, right? So I hope grief and all these different kind of mechanisms are quite kind of clear here. The other thing I wanted to kind of share with you guys is called a loss letter, right? Loss letter is another tool that you can kind of use in this, right? So imagine this is what stage. Imagine you taught the client titration, right? Imagine they are able to kind of be a little bit more closer towards understanding their secondary gain, right? Imagine that a lot of the sadness and the acceptance has kind of reached, but you're like, yeah, there's something, it's not complete yet, right? There's something left, there's some language left. What you do is you help them write a loss letter. And what I've seen is that I've seen people write loss letters open-handed, right? जो इनका एक certain open hand होता है, यानी कि like write a letter to your person, that the person you've lost, right? Like you have an open hand letter. And what I've seen is that in that open hand letter, things get said and things are unsaid, right? There's this kind of incompleteness that can kind of happen. So the stuff that we use here at the center, and the stuff it's in your drive and the manual that's been shared with you guys, is called as loss letter. This particular one is designed for parents, but in my opinion, you can use it for a drug, you can use it for anything. It's really good. I'm going to read it out and you guys can kind of see the flow of it, right? So you can have whatever person you have in mind, right? So for example, dear person, right? I remember that the way you, right? I remember when I remember how you looked when, right? I remember when you told me, right? The clearest memory I have of you is, right? I always wanted to tell you, I always was afraid to tell you, I wish I had told you, I wish I had known, I also wish. When I was with you, I usually felt, right? I felt happiness when I felt the most loved when I felt the most angriest when I felt the most hurt when I felt the most afraid when you, right? I felt the most guilty when you, I felt the most shame when you, I wish, I wanted, I needed, I accept that you, I understand that you, the last time I saw you, when you left or died, since you've been gone, I miss the way you, when I think of you now, I want to tell you I'm sorry about, I want to thank you for, most of all, I want to tell you. Okay. So this is what we call a loss letter, right? And in this particular setup, you can see that there is a whole trail of emotions that you're kind of helping the person through, right? And it is coming from a space of memory, right? So you've already done that titration work. It's coming from a space of memory. It's coming from a space of unsaid things, right? That's an important thing. It's coming from a space of emotions that you're allowing. Unfinished business is also a huge thing, right? Like with particularly with memories for people, right? There's like वो bargaining के stage के अंदर आता है कि काश मैंने उसको ये कुछ बोला होता, right? And this letter, what it does, it kind of picks up on all of these different pieces that are required depending on whatever stage you are. If you have this unleft feeling that you need to say something. So what I'm trying to say is that A, write it for yourself first, right? Use it, right? I've written this so many times. Anytime I have a person that's transitioning or going through, like, especially like in terms of life transitions, like work and XYZ, like you have to do it. Use this letter a lot, right? Like use this. This letter is there in your therapist training manual, and the one that you can also do a lot is the feelings letter also, right? So the feelings letter is also very actively in your therapist training manual. So use those letters, like left, right, and center. Kabhi bhi aapko ऐसा feel hota hai na, there's a grief that's happening. You can make an addict use this for his addiction also, because this could also be a way, one of the ways to kind of say goodbye as well, right? So this is all of that stuff that's kind of there. Would you use something similar for a client who was grieving a phase of life? Yes. So yeah, an idea or an ambiguous loss, 100%, right? Like this, as long as they are you, as long as they're able to language it in that way, this is really good for that as well. So I highly recommend it being used for that. If the client is on the sadness phase, it will not work. It depends, right? If the client, so it depends, because if you see it not working, right, then again, information, right? What you do is you help them go into titration, right? What you do is, okay, you can any like for example, what we're doing is we're playing like a really good guessing game, right? That's the max we can do, right? अगर कोई भी टेक्निक राइट द रीजन व्हाई वी डू लाइक गेस्टॉल भी है हमारे पास सीबीटी भी है हमारे पास ह्यूमरिस्टिक भी है हमारे पास टीआरई भी है ईएमडीआर भी है जो भी है इट्स अ गेस व्हाट विल वर्क फॉर द क्लाइंट as long as you're open to kind of say कि अच्छा that did not work, let me figure out what was the information that I can get from this. अच्छा, it did not work because I went too fast, it did not work because the client is too attached to the emotion yet, right? And how come I wasn't able to read that? Number one, right? And number two, okay, if it's not the right time, what else can I do? Right? Can I stay with the feeling for longer? Right? Can I actually, rather than getting them out of this feeling, can I let them actually stay in the feeling for longer? Give him acceptance. It's okay to be sad, right? And what do I need to do? And always have that I mechanism, right? कि यार मैं ऐसा क्या कर सकती हूँ जिससे मैं therapeutic work को improve कर सकूँ. If you have that growth based mindset, you're going to become so great, right? So feeling like I need some thousand prints, yeah, I swear, man, this letters, right, are like print them, right? Because I sometimes they don't use it, but like you can kind of subtly kind of give it to family members also and be like, here's something for you, right? Like you can, if you want, you can use it, right? So that's grief, right? I think it's one of the most important parts of it, and I will highly Acha, the way you use the letter, I completely forgot to tell you. Okay, so the letter is two folds. So what you do is you first, when you will be going with the client, when you're going to be asking them to do it, you ask them to write the letter. Don't ask them to write the letter at home until unless they're saying, can I write it at home? Sure, right? That's your therapeutic call. Encourage them to write the letter with you here, right? Just so that they don't flood. Number one. Okay. Number two, right? Once they have written the letter, they have to read the letter out to you, right? So even when you guys will write your own letter, you can't just keep it. You have to read it. Why? Because saying something activates different parts of the mechanism as compared to if you were have just written it in your head, right? Like there's a different reality when you say it to someone. So you have the words and you have it in your head and you have it on paper, but you have to say it to someone, right? So when you guys will do this for yourself, and I highly recommend you do it so you guys get an idea about it, find a person that can hold space for you so that you can read it out to them. Number two. Second stage, you have that. Third stage, that once they have read it out, and if there's emotional release, allow it, breathe through it, all of that stuff. They have to let the paper go. Which means what? Because grieving is all about letting go. That's what it technically is. That your body is ready and accepting to let it go. So what you do is you take whatever feelings and important lessons that you have from the paper and you keep it with you, and the rest, the paper itself, tear it, burn it, throw it. You let it go, right? Important stuff doesn't really go. It's just the representation of letting go that takes place. And that's what really, and you will feel it. And I encourage you guys to try it. You will feel yourself lighter, right? And when you will feel yourself lighter because you have completed the whole process, not just kept it in your head, you've said it to a person and you've let that go, then what you do is you reach this sense of acceptance that kind of comes in, which really helps. And you can have grieving for multiple things also, right? So this is something that I would highly recommend you guys try it out, right? I hope this was helpful for you guys today. I really hope this kind of completes the grieving aspect of it. It's one of the most important aspects of the therapeutic work. I really hope that, because now we're reaching sort of like the tail end of it. 9, we have 2 left, 10 and 11. So 10 is TRE, right? So TRE is going to be a fun one. It's about somatic work, and we kind of get through some of that somatic aspects of it. We do a little bit of trauma informed in it as well. And then our last one, which is going to be our 11th one, that's all going to be about integration, right? Like we're going to just review, cover up, really kind of get, okay, what's the intention? Eclectic approach, integrative approach. Integrative approach kis tarah banta hai, right? Because me as a therapist, different from A as a therapist, different from B as a therapist, different from C as a therapist. Never has this therapist training programs approach been to create like I was gonna say uniformity, right? To create uniformity, right? You can't do that in therapy, right? You are all different therapists with different degrees or different aspects that you will be putting into your style, right? So the idea is encouraging that uniqueness, right? Because no one can be you, right? So that's what the 11th session is going to be about, in terms of how do you create your unique style, what is done, how is it developed for people, right? And again, request is to always have a style that is open for growth, right? As long as you have a career, you need to have some like openness to grow. Otherwise, what happens is stagnation takes place. Freeze, you can't tell if it's a freeze response that's happening, So we're going to talk about all of those things and how you guys can carry forward in terms of your development as a therapist, and that would be stage 11. So we're really almost at the end of this training. I hope this has been good, and I'll hopefully see you guys next week then. All right, take care, guys.